where we've been looking at early Christian discussions about death and resurrection, anchored in the New Testament, but looking at how our kind of ancient ancestors read the New Testament and then wondered about how to imagine a continuing existence. What can we see about how ancient followers of Jesus reflected on the vulnerability of their own bodies as they discussed hopes and imaginations about the resurrection? And so this is, it does feel sometimes like a history lesson, I know, but what matters is what we see about ourselves and where we are reading from and what we're reading for. So as I've done before, I want to start with a couple of artists' ways of imagining vulnerable bodies in this strange time. And as I've done before, I'm going to ask you either to use the chat, or if you feel inclined and are willing, to unmute and comment to say, what do you see in these images of bodies in our time? And maybe add what that means for you as a viewer. So a first image here, look for a moment. Images that recall the predicament of the body in our time. What do you see? And what does that detail mean for you? And Catherine, help me if I don't have access to the chat, as you've done the last couple of weeks. Thank you. Mm-hmm. What do you see? And what does it convey about vulnerable bodies in our time?
This is Janet. I'm just sitting here shaking my head. I see what we are going through. And it's heavy. The words are important. The images, though, are heavy.
Is there a detail, Janet, that your eyes drawn to?
Well, immediately the mask.
Yeah.
But I'm living on the other side of resurrection. I've got a vaccine, so that's very hopeful.
Yeah. Yeah. Others?
In the chat, Chris says face coverage. Beth Field says a new normal. And Chuck Hinton says masks that I am tired of and vaccines that I so much want.
Yeah. Do you think these are Grateful Dead lyrics, I think? Yeah. Do you think they've been sorted out so different words go with the mask and different words go with the vaccine? What else do you see? What's a detail that draws your eye?
Trevor says, we will get by with masks and we will survive with the vaccine.
Yeah.
We have the keyboard showing people working from home and remote learning.
Yeah, that keyboard has become a way to get by and to survive. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anne says, the hands on the keyboard and our isolation.
Mm.
Bill and Crystal say kids online for school.
Yeah.
And now that I see those hands, they do look like a child's hands.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. How does the figure in the center work for you as a viewer?
Another symbol of our isolation. we do things by ourselves now. He's out hiking by himself
Mm-hmm.
with his
So,
mask.
yeah, yeah. Anyone else?
For me, and I know I typed in the chat earlier, but for me, it reminds me that if we are, I see a backpack and whatnot on the person, but if we are going somewhere and have all of what that person has on, and one of looks like even though some of us might not have been vaccinated yet, it looks like we should still have masks on and the proper tile for like going places that aren't just a house or whatever.
Yeah, an era in which we really need to be prepared. I really appreciate the candor of people naming a sense of heaviness and longing and weariness and isolation. In this next image, same questions. What do you see and what does it convey to you? This is from a feature last summer in the Washington Post. What do you see and what does it mean to you as a viewer?
Mhm.
Something that strikes me are the silhouettes in the background. I'm thinking that represents those lost.
Yeah, that's a haunting possibility. That are they being rendered as people present on the sidewalk but socially distant, or is the silhouette form suggesting people once present and not present now? That sense of loss. I think that's a possible way to interpret for sure. Yeah. Others, what do you see and what might it mean for you as a viewer?
Chuck Henson writes, yearning for connection.
Yeah. How do you see that, Chuck? How do you see that depicted? And others, what's something that draws your eye? And what does it communicate about bodies in our time?
I don't know if I was still muted when I was saying what I said, but I see the people on the street really want to be with the people on the balcony.
Yeah. Yeah. Making a connection, hailing one another, having a conversation, but separated. So, yeah. That longing for connection. Mm-hmm.
To piggyback off of what Chuck said, looking at the little one on the balcony, I at least think it, so she wants to be down with the little one and the
Yeah.
person's arms on the sidewalk, and it's giving me the impression the way she is holding the bar, like she's about to, I don't know, climb up so she can be over the top bar.
Mhm. Yeah, the implications of the distance are different for little ones, or present for little ones, visualized for little ones.
Or maybe the little one feels like they're in prison.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
In
So,
a strange way, I think I find a little bit of hope in it.
mhm.
When I see the colors, the colored bubbles that are sort of emanating from the people in the background and the guy that's on the street, and then I guess the perspective that we see. I think about the times when we had to stay at home and we had no option to go out. And then as people began to get on Zoom and as people were able to go out, even wearing masks and social distancing, there was a sense of hope there that maybe there could be something more. And it's,
Yeah.
you know, in contrast to the previous image, it feels like there's a light at the end of the tunnel. We are sort of making do and surviving and thriving to the best we can, you know, to the best of our abilities right now.
Yeah, the color palette is different, right? The sense of possibility may be conveyed in some of the figures and the colors and the yeah, maybe there a possibility was what you said, Anne. I think there's some of that as well. And Crystal and Bill, was there a comment? Catherine, could you help share?
Yes, they say, I see hearts in the air above the silhouette. Would one like to reach out to the other? Possibly romantic feelings.
Yeah. So maybe, yeah, maybe there's certainly some kind of longing for connection and affection that's communicated that way as well. Yeah.
I hope that's what it means. When I saw those people, I thought it was all those people on the street we don't pay attention to in normal times and that we pass by without giving a second thought. And we're still doing that in the pandemic. So I hope it means what the other people said, not what I saw.
Well, I think you saw a reality worth recognizing, Suzanne. Yeah. Each of these pictures does something with the differences of experience or the common experience of men and women. Can we take just a minute, 1 minute, to comment in the chat or verbally? In the last year, what have you seen or learned about how gender has made a difference in the experience of the pandemic? There might be medical answers to this, scientific answers to this. Has sexual difference made a difference in the experience of bodies in the last year? And what, if so, what would be an example of that? How has the pandemic been different for differences in gender? Anyone?
Well, certainly gender has made a difference for the females who are in childbearing years. They have been very concerned about whether they should be vaccinated, what's the long-term risk for themselves, for the unborn child. So that's a strong one.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Lindsay. Others?
Janet writes, mothers have been slammed by attending to the needs of children as well as their own needs.
Yeah. Others? What's another example?
Would be interesting to know how much maleness has had to do with the denial of the pandemic, the refusal to wear masks, and the macho kind of anti-science reaction.
That's a fascinating question.
Kind of like nobody's going to tell me what to do.
So I want to turn the corner to looking at a New Testament passage, but I'm going to use one more image first. And this one I'm using in a different way. This is an image that goes back to, a kind of game we did as kids, and maybe children still do, of looking at a picture and finding how many things are wrong with this picture. And I actually think this exercise does help us get ready for the New Testament passage that we're going to read together. So I found, to my surprise, I found an image from 1963 that's a version of this game of how many things are wrong with this picture. And I don't want to spend too long on this, but the artist says, this is from a Reader's Digest Youth Annual, there are 21 errors introduced into this picture. So get ready for the chat. How many of them can we find in 1 minute? What's wrong with this picture? And you can talk or write. What's wrong with this picture? 21 things.
First thing, no mask.
Okay, so for us, it looks like they should have masks on. Yeah.
The clock is backward.
Okay, clock is backwards. What else?
The
31
shoes are
days in
different.
June.
Shoes, 2 different shoes. Someone else?
31 days in June.
31 days in June.
Carrots growing on trees.
Carrots growing on trees.
There are books in the kitchen cabinet.
Books in the kitchen cabinet. What else?
Brooms out of the fridge.
Brooms in the fridge.
It looks
The
like
lady is floor polishing the carpet.
Yeah.
Floor polisher on the carpet. Good. What else?
It's daytime in the door and night over the sink in the sink window.
Excellent. What else?
The sleeves on her arms are different.
Very good. I didn't see that.
There's a broom in the refrigerator.
Door in the doorway.
Yeah. What's in the doorway? Sorry.
There's no door.
There's no door. Yeah.
The days are mixed up on the calendar.
Okay.
There's a broom in the refrigerator.
There's
Yeah.
no sink. Where the sink should be, there's a cabinet under it.
All right. Yeah.
There's a handle on the inside of the cabinet door under the sink.
Excellent. You guys are good.
The lady sitting down has on 2 different shoes.
Is it a lady sitting down?
That's a man sitting down.
Oh, it looks like a lady, but to me, but anyway,
Yeah,
2
cuffs
different
are
shoes.
different.
And he's reading, and we know men don't read.
Okay.
Excuse me.
And he's reading in an easy chair in the kitchen.
Numbers backwards.
Okay. Yeah.
One of the
cuffs on
wheels,
his pants are different.
The curtains are out. The curtains are outside the window.
one of the
Curtains
wheels
are-
is missing on the chair.
Yeah. Good.
He's
All right.
got a clock on one hand.
Okay. That's a minute. Does anything else strike you when you first saw this picture that maybe the artist didn't intend, but when we look at it in our year, this 1963 depiction strikes us as something unintentional.
See the carrots growing in the corner.
The gender roles are perfect.
Oh, so no problem there. Okay. Yeah. So I'm not sure in 1963 that kids were supposed to think there was a tension there, but maybe they were supposed to think she works while he reads was something wrong with this picture. But there's an interesting assumption about gender here in the midst of things that are deliberately wrong and supposed to make you think about what's wrong. Okay, so we're going to the New Testament. I promised we would. We really are going to. And we're in a story during Holy Week. Jesus and his followers are in Jerusalem. And in this particular chapter, we're going to start with Mark. People are trying to set a set of tricks and traps. So Pharisees have just asked him a tax-paying question. After this episode, a scribe's going to ask him to sort out what's the most important commandment. But right now we have a controversy that involves the Sadducees. The Sadducees were a leadership group in ancient Judaism, characterized by particular kinds of beliefs and practices. They were mostly influential in Jerusalem and had a lot to do with cooperation with the Romans and the running of the temple, as best we can tell. An ancient Jewish historian says they were not popular among the people. They were kind of associated with the elite. But they come to Jesus to pose a question in the days leading up to the climactic events of the Gospels. So from the Gospel of Mark, what's wrong with this picture? What shows their question to be insincere? What's problematic about the scenario that they paint that has to do with the afterlife? Some Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to Jesus and asked him a question, saying, "Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and he leaves behind a wife but leaves no child, his brother must take the wife and raise up children for his brother. There were 7 brothers. The first took a wife, and when he died, left no children. And the second took her, and he died, leaving no children. And the third likewise. And so none of the 7 left children. Last of all, the woman herself died. In the resurrection, whose woman will she be? For the 7 had her as wife." What in this story looks like it's not sincere? Or what in this story makes you uncomfortable? What have the Sadducees built into it to be a problem? What are they exposing about their own assumptions that we might think is a problem? What do you think about this story presented, this picture painted for Jesus?
Well, for me, and just if there were 7 brothers and only one female as a wife, and seems weird to have the first brother who died no one. I just think brothers of the first one shouldn't marry the same person.
Yeah. So there is a rule in Deuteronomy saying if a man dies without an heir, his brother should preserve his name by having an heir, but they're trying to make it absurd, right? And so that number 7 with one woman, I think, Chris, it makes sense to feel uncomfortable and feel like this just doesn't feel right.
Lynn writes, if Sadducees don't believe in resurrection, why are they asking about the resurrection?
Right. So there's something wrong with the picture. Why are they asking Jesus to weigh in on resurrection? They know he believes in resurrection, but they don't. So it's not a sincere question, right? Yeah. What else?
They're treating the woman as a piece of property, it sounds like.
Yeah. And I don't think they see that as a problem in the scenario, right? It's a passing of her from one hand to another. And where does that property piece show up? Was that Roger who spoke?
Yes.
Where did it show up to you the most, that sense that the woman has become property?
Well, it's the last question of the of the scripture. In the resurrection, whose woman will she be?
Yeah, who does she belong to, right? So you imagine 7 men lined up. Like, is it who has to take her? Who gets to take her? She's not presented as a self, really, I think. Others?
Does this presume that relationships between people are the same in the resurrection as they are in the life that we know today?
Okay, good. So you're setting us up for what Jesus might say, Chuck. Perfect question. I don't have to answer because it turns out Jesus does, which is always better. Yeah, but there's something, I mean, maybe the Sadducees think this is ridiculous because even if they have memories of biblical stories of polygamy, that's usually one man with more than one wife. There's no model for one woman with multiple husbands in biblical storytelling, right? And so maybe that's what makes it seem ridiculous from their eyes. But this passing of a woman from person to person, her predicament is just, she's simply an object for a trick that the Sadducees want to play. So Jesus replies to them. Jesus said to them, "Is not this the reason you're wrong? You know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven." So Chuck, did Jesus answer your question? To what extent?
Yes, it's not, heaven is not like earth.
Yeah. So from this is a pretty short answer. In what way is heaven not like earth? In what way is then not like now, according to Jesus' answer? Chuck or anyone?
Equality between the men and the women. If they're all like angels, no one is held in marriage by someone else. And there's no hierarchy there. They're all equal.
Yeah, so are like angels in heaven, there's a kind of equalization. That second to last line distinguishes, you know, we assume in this life, in Jesus' time, men marry and women are given in marriage. At least that's the way the Sadducees presented it, right? And that goes away. That sense of a gender divide in the status of people. So it is implied sharing a quality of existence similar to angels means that hierarchy goes away. Anyone else? Why might marriage go away in the afterlife? Marrying and giving in marriage go away in the afterlife, or what might be the implications of that?
I think when you talk about marriage, you think about physical bodies, and then they talk about angels in heaven, which I think of as without having a physical body.
Okay. And yeah, so at least not the same kind of, you know, material body, right?
And
yeah.
we belong to God, not to another soul.
Okay, I like this. I like this. Yes. We belong to God, not to someone else. What else might be a reason why marriage isn't necessary in heaven?
There's that whole until death do you part, do we part, and you've already died, so.
Yeah, that's an interesting reflection on the vows that we take, right? Yeah. So there are good reasons to think that Mark was the earliest gospel written, and that when Matthew and Luke were doing their writing, they used Mark as a source. So it's kind of interesting to sometimes compare. Look what the Gospel of Luke adds to Jesus' answer. Jesus said to them, "The children of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy of a place in that age and in the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. Indeed, they cannot die anymore because they're like angels and are children of God, being children of the resurrection." What does Luke draw out by amplifying Jesus' answer?
The equality of all, the unity of all there.
Yeah, so that Anne had already drawn out some of the implications of angels in heaven, but Luke doesn't want us to miss it. Like angels, children of God, children of the resurrection. This applies to both the men and the women. Yeah. Anyone else? What does Luke draw out?
He adds that there's a worthiness component to this, which Mark does not have. You have to be worthy to be in that, to have a place in that age and to be resurrected.
Yeah, Luke wants to draw out that thinking about the afterlife is not just hypothetical. It's supposed to make you want to be like that, right? It's supposed to have an effect on you in this life, that you want to be worthy of a place in that age. You want to be worthy of being a child of God ultimately. And so that drawing a line between visions of the afterlife and this life is something Luke doesn't want us to miss. I suspect Mark thought he did that, but Luke doesn't want us to miss it. It's interesting that for the next centuries of Christianity, people who were drawn to renounce marriage in this life were really drawn to the Luke version of this passage, because they were saying, well, if there's not going to be marriage in the afterlife, then my choice of renouncing marriage or renouncing sexuality, or, we're on a trajectory that will eventually give us monks and nuns, right? But that starts with Jesus, we have no reason to think Jesus married. So if we have a single celibate savior, there are people who were drawn to this as saying, maybe renouncing marriage now is okay. There were also people we know from writings who drew consolation that poor hypothetical woman going through 7 hypothetical men is really stigmatized for not having a child. But there were followers of Jesus in the early centuries that said whether or not a woman reproduces is not a measure of her worthiness. Just look at what the resurrection will be like. If people don't die anymore, they don't have to have any more babies, as part of the assumption in the ancient world. But whether or not you've had a child is not a test of being a child of God, or your worthiness in the resurrection. Jesus goes on we'll do Luke because it's a little longer again, to also point out what he means by saying the Sadducees don't understand the scripture. The fact that the dead are raised, Moses himself showed in the story about the bush, where he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is God not of the dead, but of the living, for to him all of them are alive. I really love this kind of insight that Luke offers when God is revealed as the God of the ancestors. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That present tense applies to the continuing presence of God. But according to Jesus, it also implies the ancestors are still present. Just because of the vulnerabilities of the elders in my family this week, when I read this getting ready for class, I thought, when I think of the God of Kate and George Lipsett and the God of Joan Lipsett, the God of my ancestors, it's not just that God is continuing to be present, but even thinking that way, Jesus says, is a way of saying the ancestors still are with us, present with God in some essential way. I kind of like the way Luke edited Mark at the end. Mark has it just ending with Jesus saying, "You are quite wrong." But Luke elaborates a little bit to say some of those listening, the scribes answered, "Teacher, you have spoken well." And then the Sadducees no longer dare to ask him another question. early Christians really thought and debated a lot about what this like angels meant. It meant not mortal, therefore no marriage and no procreation. Some of you have already spoken to the kind of delight in the presence of God. Did being like angels mean that relationship with God and God's presence somehow sufficed? But they also debated what being like angels meant for whether or not people still had gender differentiation or sexual difference in the afterlife. You all have spoken so richly about possibilities of these scriptures that I want to go to a kind of later point in the presentation than I had in my slides. So forgive me for going ahead a bit here. There were early Christians who were really interested in the idea that there wouldn't be gender differentiation in the afterlife, that somehow male and female would be unified, that there'd be a kind of single way of being gendered, a unified way of being gendered in the afterlife. Last week, we looked at a text that imagined everyone in the afterlife would be a 30-year-old body, and really a 30-year-old male was the idea. In the Gospel of Thomas, there's an interesting saying where Jesus and the disciples imagine everyone kind of turns back to a much more basic form of human being. That means the male isn't male or the female female, but there's some fundamental unity in the afterlife that's not differentiated by gender. And this is a way of imagining what Paul said, if you look at the last line here, that ultimately being one in Jesus does away with male and female. And I think back to what some of you have said about doing away with hierarchy or doing away with subordination, doing away with seeing women merely as property. There could be something very freeing about this way of thinking about gender going away in the afterlife. I also find it kind of limiting, and I'm still attracted to some of the parts of Jesus and Paul and second century interpreters that say, no, sexual difference is actually part of our identity. If the human self is not the soul with a replaceable body, but a combination of body and soul, then maybe in the resurrection, we retain some aspects of a stable identity. These second century writers, as I suggested a couple weeks ago, talk about how the care and the memory of God preserves the whole person. And there are parts of our identity that matter in the afterlife. And so as we see in stories about the resurrection of Jesus, there's something that's different, but something that's still recognizable, that anticipates the resurrection of believers' bodies. And for these writers, there were ethical consequences of imagining the resurrection that way. Picking up on that, could you be worthy of a resurrection where there isn't hierarchy and subordination? Everyone is a child of God and a child of the resurrection. But what you do in your body is part of how you get there. So the writer I introduced a couple weeks ago, Athenagoras, talks about how our frail and earthy bodies are the condition in which we choose and practice the good. Vulnerable bodies aren't just to be cast off for the resurrection, but they matter for how we choose and practice the good. And when Athenagoras and others talk specifically about gender and marriage, about sexuality and sexual difference, they talk about, I mean, I really like some of the language he uses. He talks about how our bodies feel yearnings. That's actually a word that one of you used about the pandemic images at the beginning, what we yearn for. Talks about our enjoyments, about marriage, about kindness, about violence that can happen in contexts of sexual difference, about pleasure and delight, that humans make choices among such options. And they're not just choices of the body or mind. I mean, sorry, of the soul or mind. They're choices that we make in the body, so that vulnerable bodies matter. To these writers, interpreting passages like the controversy with the Sadducees, they didn't want this idea of imagining ourselves like angels to mean we didn't assume there were sexual differences in the resurrection, but that to honor sexual virtue and choice requires imagining sexual difference in the afterlife, that intelligence and virtue and self-discipline derive from both body and soul. We see virtue differently, they argued, if we see the embodied self as durable. They didn't want us to imagine resurrected bodies that had bile or phlegm or blood or even air, but that there's some architecture of the self that continues into the presence of God. So in those ideas, is there anything you see that feels meaningful to you in reflecting on what it means to be a vulnerable body in our time, leaning into the hopes that Easter represents? Anything you see in that view of that passage from the New Testament that means something to you this morning?
Back to the whole thing of being worthy for resurrection. I think that's going to stay in my head for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. To yearn for that. One more person.
Diane, you raised the question about the quote from the earlier scripture of Jesus's response about God being the God of the living, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in that a sense of the presence of God, that they are in the presence of God. That raises in my mind then why is the resurrection necessary if they're already in the presence of God? But that then gets over to the point I think you were talking about with the body. The body is important, and that connection there. Well, in Paul with the parousia and the return of Jesus, where people are resurrected. Well, if they're already in the presence of God, then what's the purpose of resurrection?
Right. And I think ultimately for Paul and those who are focused on that resurrection hope, maybe the most important thing they draw from it is the ethical significance for this life and the reassurance that what you go through in the body matters. And it matters in an ultimate way. What you endure in the body matters. What you choose in the body matters. The body is not an insignificant part of the life lived for God and in the presence of God now or later, right? They have to do all kinds of dances to say how soul and body get back together in the afterlife. And it's speculative, of course it is. But the deep conviction they have is your work matters now. What you're going through matter now. Your yearnings matter now. Your loneliness matters now. These are embodied experience, and we make choices of what's good in our bodies, not just in some abstract way with our souls. So I think that's what matters most to these, right, Paul and the later writers. And the longing, yeah, we make choices in our embodied selves, not in some detached way. Yeah. Next week, so we've managed to talk about bodies in the afterlife, race and disability in the afterlife, gender in the afterlife. Next week, I want us to talk about love and knowledge and what the scriptures say and early readers of the scriptures say about what love and knowledge tell us about our access to the presence of God now and later. Thanks for chiming in so readily with the different images and with the text as well. I appreciate what I go away with from your insights, and hope you continue in worship today, that you continue in living a life that's open to the presence of God this day as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Very
everyone.
nice.
Thank you.
Thanks, Diane.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you, Diane.